it's not so much about knowing all the answers, but the ability to kind of ask the key questions in every situation, and then to kind of bring it all together. So I'm saying, hey, if you're running a business unit, don't just think like an operator. Think, hey, if I'm an investor, if I'm a shareholder, if I'm a board member of IBM, how would I look at this situation? And when I'm interacting with a customer, what are the various forces on that particular decision maker? Is he taking the point of view of some?
Welcome to another episode of Pioneers of Possible, the show that connects you with the futurists, leaders, dreamers, and builders who have reshaped what's possible in the worlds of business and technology. I'm Des Blanchfield, your host and fellow technologist. And today I have the pleasure of having Max Michaels, General Manager of IBM Network Services, with me in the studio. Hi, Max. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Awesome to have you on the show. Thank you very much for making time to join me. I know it's about 6 o'clock in the morning at your end in New York.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
I think you mentioned it's still dark there. Is that right?
Yes, New York is still waking up.
It's a bit cool as well, I understand. Well, it's 11 o'clock here in the middle of the night, and it's dark on my side, so we're both technically in the dark, as it were. Now, Max, could we perhaps just get you, for folk who don't know you and are just getting to know you now, could you perhaps just give us a quick intro to yourself personally, just a little bit about Max Michaels and who you are, and specifically around your role as General Manager of IBM Network Services?
So I run network services business for IBM globally, and network services is a part of GTS, that is Global Technology Services, which is about 40% of IBM's businesses. And network services is one of the 4 service lines within GTS. And it is a significant business for IBM. And we have been in this business for the past 35 years, so clearly a long-standing business, which has a lot of momentum behind us at this point.
You bring quite a pedigree to this role. We were talking earlier, and there's a number of brands that you've been able to build on. I know there's mention of brands like AT&T and Cisco and others behind you. Could you perhaps share some insight into kind of your career path and some of the organizations you've worked with or for, and what they've helped you bring to this role?
Well, when I've been around, so I spent 6 years at Cisco Systems, telecom space. I also spent some time at AT&T before I joined IBM. I started my career as a management consultant at McKinsey, did some banking at Morgan Stanley. So that's quickly my background, but clearly a lot of those experiences and what I learned from these large corporations are helping me deliver on many of the promises I need to keep at this point that IBM is making to its shareholders and to its customers.
Of course, yeah. Now, before we get into the role too much, I wonder if you would mind if we can just get to know you a little bit better. In some of the conversation we had prior to starting the recording, there are a few things that really caught my attention. One of the things I was interested in, you've got a series of hobbies that you have that you participate in just to kind of get out and just wind down, and you mentioned a few, like you used to play tennis with your 2 daughters and your wife, that you love walking the dog, but swimming you said was a big one. Tell us about where does that fit into the world and on a day-to-day basis in the life of Max Michaels?
Well, I know everyone likes to hit the gym every evening. That's not what I get to do, but anytime I get a chance, I manage to get into the pool, and clearly having lived in Dallas before I moved to New York, clearly, that is a habit I got into, and I continue that. I also like to walk my dog. In fact, run with my dog might be a better way to put it. I have a 7-year-old Australian Shepherd called Charlie Brown, and he likes running, so I jog with him in the park. So those are some of the things that keep me active physically and also help me refresh my thoughts and thinking.
I like your choice of dog. I was talking to someone recently on a podcast, and they too had an Australian cattle dog, which really caught me. Yeah, absolutely. Like I can totally relate to that. I think we were talking earlier, and I take our hound for walks around Sydney Harbour, and occasionally when something's just really caught me off guard or I just need a bit of downtime, I love nothing better than just throw the ball at the poor animal and have it chase it around and occasionally just get some clarity of thought. One of the things that I was also interested in, and I'd love to get some background on, is in early childhood you had a number of key influences, but in particular you mentioned that your grandmother, I think it was, who you said was a principal of a school. Can you share some insight into kind of the early inspiration and influence that she might have given to you personally?
Yeah, sure. So my grandma was a very educated woman, and I was the firstborn, so the oldest kid of the oldest grandchild for her. So she spent a whole lot of time with me, and they used to tell me stories which inspired me and kind of challenged me in many ways. And subsequently, now that I've read so many more books since then, I found that these are all stories she had picked from her own reading, and she used to be a voracious reader. And recently I had to give a talk, and I was relating a story, and I then realized that, that's a story I picked up from her so many years ago. This is a story about 4 men going to a forest to catch a big game, and then one of them gets distracted and chases a rabbit instead, and hence, none of them end up catching the game. So the story, in fact, is a story from, one of the famous philosophers, Rousseau himself, but the way she, personalized that for me, kind of kept it in my mind and my heart in many ways through all these years. So stories like that clearly influenced me. So clearly I've been inspired by ideas through those influences. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it, that I have similar experiences in early childhood and then teenage years, particularly teenage years. And for myself anyway, and I'm sure you're the same based on what you've just shared there, that it is actually quite valuable and important to turn back and look at those inspirations and what shaped us over life, because in many ways some of the key behaviors and practices and decision-making processes we go through are formed very early on, and sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. And it sounds like you had some fantastic inspiration there. I was also interested to hear that you had later in life, as your career was growing, with some of the companies you've been dealing with, and certainly some of the senior people in those organizations, you mentioned a couple of examples, and there was one in particular around EDS and a couple of the firms there that you mentioned where, not so much mentors, but some early access to some of those really big idea thinkers that I'd love to get some further insight into that perhaps helped you shape your professional career and your career path maybe.
Right. So I guess what I mentioned to you was about the influence Michael Jordan had on him. Michael Jordan was the legendary CEO of Westinghouse and CBS. And when I met with him, he had just taken over as the chairman and CEO of EDS, which is going through a restructuring. And he hired me out of New York and then asked me to move to the headquarters of EDS in Texas. And I got to work with him very, very closely. And it was I was still in my 30s and had a chance to kind of watch him closely and learn. And many of the things that I had assumed about CEOs and what they do changed based on those experiences. In particular, I realized how highly he valued business judgment amongst the people who worked for him. So then that became an important attribute when I would judge myself and my performance, as well as people who are collaborating with me. That is one thing. The other thing I remember is, CEOs clearly are not just people who are operators; they are also investors, and where we allocate the resources can dramatically change the future of a corporation. And I saw that firsthand and how it helped EDS transform itself and eventually sell the company to HP. So I went through that whole journey along with him. So clearly a lot of learning from that.
I guess in many ways that shapes up a lot of what you bring to the table today. I remember reading a couple of articles and even I think a recent blog, and one of the things that really struck me, and you mentioned a few phrases that jumped out of this, and that is this whole concept of thinking differently, which obviously fits very nicely with IBM's mantra of thinking differently, but also just divergent thinking and new ideas in general. I imagine that some of those early influences that you just described there help shape that approach as to how to come to current projects or challenges or whatever it might be, and to bring them to what you do personally, but also to what you offer to the team, I guess.
Yeah, very much. I think it was at MIT that I picked this up. The idea was that a mind stretched with a new idea never goes back to its original state. So, so the role we all need to play as leaders to be, opening the minds of other people before the change can happen. So again, that's another idea which I've kept close to my heart. Yeah.
I like the sound of that. I'm going to actually steal that line. A mind that's stretched to, it never returns to early state. I think there's a number of key takeaways with that with folk who are listening. Where we get a lot of folk listening who are either still in university or in college, as it were, who are looking early part of their career, looking to sort of learn. And I think there's no value that can be placed on how important it is to look at some of these thought leaders that we've seen over the generations, over the years, particularly some of those very big brands of the Ciscos and the AT&Ts, and you mentioned EDS, who are now I think part of HP. Some of the things that they had to deal with, some of the early ground they broke. Those opportunities don't always arise that often these days, where back then there was no option but to think differently and to come at things very differently. There's another one where I remember we were talking about it, and you mentioned you were leading a team that took out, I think it was first place in a McKinsey Worldwide Practice Olympics, and you threw some fairly unorthodox strategies, I think, to sort of grow a new business. What can you share around those sort of unorthodox strategies and thinking that made that possible?
Yeah, that is some of my early thinking. It came out of some work I did as a graduate student at MIT, and we were looking at how people look at investment opportunities or making any commitments for the long term, and clearly any commitment in the long term, especially when those commitments are in some sense irreversible, and then there is a lot of uncertainty. People are relying on some standardized tool to kind of come up with that. And one of the early tools we have all used in finance is based on capital asset pricing models. That is, we go and estimate the net present value of an opportunity, assuming a certain level of risk for the future cash flows. And even today, that is the most dominant model that we all use, both in the financial world and also inside the business world. So the thinking there was that in the business world cannot be directly compared to what happens in the financial world, where if you acquire or buy stock, you have very few options or ability to change the outcome. Whereas if you are running a business like I'm right now, there are so many changes you can make even after you make the commitment based on how the market evolves and how the customer perceptions and preferences change. So that was the intuition. And then instead of relying on CAPM, I used Black-Scholes formula those days, which is a way of option pricing modeling to do that. So the intuition there is that you are able to influence a few key variables, including uncertainty itself, if you're able to take a set of actions. And that then is what won the Global Practice Olympics at McKinsey, and I published that article. And that is an idea which I have used subsequently in every place I went in some form or fashion. And I continue to use that right now in my current role at IBM.
I guess even knowing how to throw a partial differential equation at something like an investment option is a fairly unique approach to start with. You did actually at one point lead a venture capital firm that invested in software companies. I guess that gave you a fairly unique view of the world in that when you come to a business opportunity, if you're looking at it from an investment point of view, if you're a venture capitalist, you quite literally have money on the line. So that must also help shape up, I guess, your view of how opportunities and so forth are approached in your current role in many ways, I'm assuming.
Oh, very much, yeah. So that again was a great experience, and again lessons which are unforgettable, right? Because you are investing your capital and capital from other investors into in those days technology opportunities, and how do you minimize the risk? And again, what I just discussed about, other ways of thinking about that in terms of how do you create situations where you have the right to grow or invest when the opportunities shape up, but minimizing the obligation that you're making early on when the uncertainties are very high. That is a principle that I used, and that really helped me. And again, I find several avenues where such thinking can help inside large corporations such as IBM. And I'm doing that within my service line now.
And in many ways, when you look at what you're doing now at IBM across your general manager role through the network services part of the business, there must be some significantly large industry sectors you're dealing with currently. But your background from memory includes the likes of telco and IT services broadly, electronics and banking and biotech and real estate and oil and gas. And I remember reading a long list of these, not just in North America, but across Europe and Latin America and India. There's an enormous depth and pedigree you're drawing on this, so I can only imagine what it's like to get a new opportunity come through the door. And I think you mentioned one in particular. We can't talk about the actual brand itself, but I understand it's a global lifestyle beverage, let's call it that. I'm really keen to kind of hear how you threw yourself at that challenge and what the team around you sort of brought to the table to win something of that scale, of that I guess capacity, that size.
Right. Sure. So the business we run, we are helping large corporations, say, such as Lufthansa, for instance. That's clearly a name I can mention, has been a long time customer of IBM, to make large investments in creating a global network, right? So they can be efficient. They can get the data where they need it on each device that they need it on a timely basis. And that is a complex problem to solve. But more importantly, it involves investments in the infrastructure, which would be difficult to change once it has been committed. So a lot of that thinking that I talked about becomes important. So part of the reason why we were able to prevail upon 12 other competing bids in that particular win that I mentioned, which will be announced in a few weeks, is that we were able to show them over the different time horizons how our solution would give them more optionality or more flexibility depending on how the technology evolves and based on their own experiences with the technologies that we are providing for them. So that kind of thinking is very, very important. Yet when you try to sell a large project just as a technology, it doesn't come clear. So it's important to get the right audience, and it's important to kind of communicate that correctly. That's what we did, and that enabled us to win that large contract.
Where do you see the biggest shifts taking place in some of that decision making? So when a deal of that size comes across the table, and all of those things you've mentioned, are there two or three key areas where you see people experiencing a shift in change? Across not just cloud and big data and analytics and cognitive. Are there key standout areas that you think that your team are able to help people just, I guess, not so much an epiphany, but an aha moment when you're in a room with them and whether you're performing Jedi mind tricks with whiteboard markers or just relaying some of the value you bring? Is there a consistent theme, or are there particular things that jump out where you just look at and realize, yes, this is what IBM's brought to the table that's unique to not you personally so much, the team and the business as a whole, that clients look at it and go, yeah, we're in the right place and the right time with the right people?
There is one in particular which differentiates IBM as a corporation in this space, which is there is a huge convergence happening between the IT world and what has traditionally been the telecom world. These two worlds are really coming together. And the kind of convergence which started off with the advent of internet, but it has all become real now. And many corporations used to run their IT and networks separately, and they used to have separate leadership teams. But in most of these deals that I'm talking about, we really are able to get the mind share of both the decision makers and oftentimes one of the C-level executives as well, to kind of engage in what are the business implications of what we're doing. So, we are moving away from pure IT outcomes to more converged outcomes between IT and telecom, and going one step further into the business outcomes that we need to deliver. So we are able to help them change their business models based on the convergence between IT and telecom. And I can expand on that.
Yeah, definitely. I guess we see a lot of this. There's a broad spectrum here, but if we were going to focus on a couple of key points, we've heard about I guess the celebrity experience that people often sort of refer to as the Kardashian experience online. People want to be a celebrity when they're treated, dealt with companies. They don't just want to be a number. They want to be mobile. They want it all in their sort of smartphone device. I'm definitely seeing a shift to, you know, what an associate of mine, as mentioned, I think he calls it technology in the boardroom, and that is that the days of having coloured graphs and printouts of what happened yesterday or last week at a boardroom discussion is very historical and archaic, and these days everyone's running around with tablets with dashboards and real-time analytics. But yeah, I would love to get some more insight into what you were talking about there as to kind of where you see that driving as far as not just the mobile piece, but also, I guess, what we're often hearing about, the always-on component as well, which really surely network is the underpinning foundational component of it, isn't it? That, you know, we can only be always on if that network piece is already there and it's safe and secure and trusted.
Yeah, and always on, in fact, happens to be one of the initiatives as part of network services. In fact, we have around 100 team members who are focused on delivering always on services. In particular, they enable global events such as Wimbledon and US Open to happen. So you can imagine the complexity of delivering that in a seamless fashion to tens of millions of viewers during the currency of those events. And we are now taking those lessons and saying, hey, how can we help enterprises do that on a day-to-day basis when they're talking about cloud and hybrid cloud connectivity? So that's the next phase of that, and clearly those are the new initiatives we are currently focused on.
It's almost like the new normal, isn't it? I remember in the year 2000, Australia had the opportunity to host the Olympics here, and at that stage I was an IBMer in a form in a contract role, and so I got a lot of deep dive experience to IBM's capability to essentially run the Olympics, if you like. Everything from data centers being built in 42-foot containers on the back of trucks, all the way through to the real-time data being streamed to over then ISDN lines to radio and television networks. And it was interesting that a lot of commentators in the business world, they picked up on the fact that very few companies have the capacity that IBM does to actually run an Olympics and all the nuances that go with it. And I think, as you just alluded to there now, whether it's the we've had the Australian Open here, where tennis has got
which was run by IBM last year, just so you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I went to the Australian Open as a guest of IBM's recently, and it was interesting to see. Just we were actually looking at our smartphones, getting real time data, including the score, more than looking up a scoreboard, which is a 40-foot long display, right? And it really struck me that here we are at a live match. I'm so close I can get sweat on or spat on by one of the opponents, and yet I'm looking at my smartphone with live streaming, live data, and guess who was driving it, right? And I guess the really interesting little tidbit that you've dropped there that I just wanted to circle back on is that always-on component that we see with the Olympics experience, with the Tennis Open experience. I mean, this is kind of the norm. What do they say? It's like the always on, or the sort of the whole network piece is the new black. This is what we expect when we wake up. People pick up their smartphones and they want to see what's happening with social media. They want to see the news, where they're watching Netflix. What does that actually mean to it when a client comes to IBM and so forth? What are some of the things that they have to go through as far as a learning experience is concerned when they come to you and they've got these challenges that they normally throw at you? How do you approach that whole concept of, this is the new normal, always on is the new normal, secure is always the new normal, things like blockchain and encryption, there must be some astounding looks on people's faces when you can actually say, yes, we can do always on.
Yeah, very much. I think you asked, what is that we learn? I mean, in many ways for IBM, it's what we learn after we have seen it all that counts, right? So we have seen it all, and we have learned a lot from all those experiences. And it's interesting for us to see, all over the world, if you look at the number of hours people interact with the smartphones or the smart devices is dramatically growing, right? And in the US, that number has now crossed 16 hours a day. I mean, just almost like saying, except for the times you're sleeping, you really are interacting with it on a continual basis. So that puts a lot of pressures on the networks, but it also puts a lot of pressure on kind of making that data relevant and smarter and useful for the user. And that is the problem that the enterprise customers are solving, right? So when we talk about creating large managed networks, we're really doing it so that they can go ahead and serve a customer. Like let's talk about a global car rental company. I mean, how will you change the experience of renting that car, starting from the time you books and the time that they just turn the car back in, and that is being facilitated through seamless connectivity and convergence of cloud and connectivity. So that's the central message I'm communicating to our customers. So I basically ask them the question, what you're trying to migrate to the cloud, but what is a cloud without connectivity? I mean, It's like your iPhone in airplane mode, really, right? We're talking about iPhones and smartphones now. Clearly, in an airplane mode, of course, you can play with it, but, it's still waiting for data and workloads. So these clouds are really, the networks are enabling the clouds. So without that, the clouds can't exist in its form and can't be, useful. Then the next phase is that these clouds themselves are becoming network. That is the next phase. That's the next phase of the evolution. So that is what is most exciting for me, inside IBM, running network services. So, and IBM as a cloud company is leading the way, the transformation of cloud becoming the network and moving the cloud all the way to the edge, to closer and closer to the points of consumption. And that is the journey which, wakes me up in the morning and say, come on, I got stuff to get done. And that's what, motivates me to get on that early morning call with Japan and then with India, and, it goes on. So, and that is something IBM is uniquely qualified to do. And we have the permission, we have the credibility to do that.
Well, anyone that's quoting famous basketball coaches like John Wooden on, we only learn when we learn at the edge of knowing everything, it's probably got a lot to bring to this whole role. Now, I was interested to hear so much about kind of early stages of your life and certainly your professional career, but I'm really curious just to delve back into that really quickly. Is there something inside you and your character and what you bring to this that most people may not know about you? I mean, you've got an enormous depth and breadth of capability, and you've alluded to a couple of your, I guess, approaches around divergent thinking and new ideas. Is there something that most people may not know about you as to how you approach these things, or just the general character you bring to the role?
So I think it's basically a combination of things we just discussed. So I really think that I tend to be more reflective. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that we are not young enough to know everything, right? So clearly, it's not so much about knowing all the answers, but the ability to kind of ask the key questions in every situation, and then to kind of bring it all together. So I'm saying, hey, if you're running a business unit, don't just think like an operator. Think, hey, if I'm an investor, if I'm a shareholder, if I'm a board member of IBM, how would I look at this situation? And when I'm interacting with a customer, what are the various forces on that particular decision maker? Is he taking the point of view of someone who has to get the stuff done? Is he under time pressures? Is that the only consideration? Or is he thinking in terms of the time horizons in front of him? And how do I improve his capacity to deliver his promises? And how do I improve his ability to kind of think across these time horizons so he gets the best outcome and the best total cost for operations? So those are some of the thinking that I bring, and has helped me. And I hope I can continue to help IBM and the industry as it reshapes itself.
Oh, I have no fear of that. I don't think there's any doubt of that. Now, before we wrap up, one of my favorite things to do with folk, and I hope you don't mind me asking this, is to kind of do a little bit of crystal ball gazing. And it's one of my favorite puns in the IBM as to, what's in the horizon, right? Being a big IBM Watson fan. What's in the horizon as far as the world's concerned, or you personally? If I was to throw to you this idea that if you were to gaze into a crystal ball and look over the next 12 to 18 months, let's just say a year to year and a half, are there any particular things, any epiphanies, any big ideas that jump out at you, either you personally or professionally in your career, or IBM or the world in general? Is there something that's just burning as an idea in your mind that you could share that you think that people might be surprised to kind of conceive or grasp as something that's just coming over the horizon the next year and a half or so?
So what's on the horizon? I guess your answer is Watson, right? And I agree with you, because Watson and cognitive capabilities is really going to change the way we interact with each other and how we experience the world in many ways, right? So that's happening. And again, for me, the crystal ball, or the crystal, really is using the lens of network services. And so the primary vector of disruption there is this convergence that I talked about, and what the virtualization and the software-defined infrastructure, as we call inside at IBM, is dramatically changing, the whole enterprise managed services world. So that is the biggest change, and that change, when you combine with the ability for software-defined infrastructure to provide data in a seamless fashion to improve the decision-making, that's where Watson comes in. So as we speak, we are building a platform which we call it the IBM Services Platform with Watson to enable our customers to do that. And there's a lot of interest and excitement around that.
I did like your line, and I've actually written it down because I suspect we could do a whole show on it following on this. But I love this idea that cloud is the network. We've had a number of iterations around the concept that, the network is the computer and so forth and so forth. But, I do like this idea that, over the next year and a year and a half or so, we're going to see what you alluded to there with this whole concept of the cloud as a network. Where do you think that's going to be in a year's time, in a year and a half's time, though? I mean, as far as the concept of the cloud as a network and things pushing out to the edge. I mean, when I think about something like, I'm a big fan of airplanes, for example, and when many people have probably heard me say this before, but when the Dreamliner 787 came out and they announced that it generated about 0.5 terabyte of data per flight, no matter how long it was, I went and looked at the US market for a keynote I was giving for IBM some years ago, and it struck me that there was something like 87,500 or 87,400 flights a day just in the domestic airspace and US alone in North America. And so I did the math and I was like, well, hang on, if there's 87,400 flights a day, that's 500 terabytes, that's 43 petabytes a day. There's no way we're going to copy that off the plane across the network and into a central cloud and mainframe architecture style sort of, terminal to the server. And so I 110% agree that this whole concept of cloud as a network is going to have to shift to the whole edge. Where do you think that's going to be, though, in the next year or year and a half, as far as what that even looks like? How does that shape up as far as this concept that you mentioned of the cloud as the network?
So the cloud as the network, or the cloud becomes the network, is happening today. So it's already happened, except that it's, in terms of adoption rate, I think more than 40% of the enterprises have adopted that. But if you were to look at the revenue numbers, it'll take 2 or 3 years for that to catch up. So that's the phase at which it is. But the point you're making really is about how the explosion of data, and you talked about the example of each airplane generating so much data, how that increases the demand for everything to be software defined, so that the compute, storage, and networks can all converge into one entity, which provides that value to the customer.
Yeah.
Because imagine, if the storage is not there, then you're not able to provide the cloud or the compute capabilities, because you need to be able to combine them and then connect it back to the end user so that it is usable. So that is what is changing, that convergence between storage, compute, and connectivity.
And I guess it's always that cat and mouse game, isn't it? Because even if we were to catch up the Boeing 787 Dreamliner and this 43 petabytes of data potentially created just every day inside the North American market, Airbus, not to be outdone, recently bought out, I think it was the A330 or the A350, and it now generates 2.5 terabytes of flights. So when we do the math of 87,400 flights a day just at the domestic airspace in the US alone, and 2.5 terabytes, that's something in the order of 220 petabytes of raw data. It's a whole new order of magnitude times 2. And again, whole new design patterns have to be brought about. Well, look, I think there's a whole new show on that topic alone, so we're going to wrap up there. But Max Michaels, thank you so much for your time. Folks, you've had an enormous amount of insight there, both personally into Max Michaels, General Manager of IBM Network Services, and his career path, and some great insights into what's happening around the thinking approach and I guess delivery models that he's bringing to this exciting role. And we look forward to having you on the show again soon, Max, and maybe delving into the cloud as a network story in a bit more detail.
Sure, I look forward to it. Thank you, Des. Thank you for the great questions. I really enjoyed it.